Continuing on the Pacers player free agency previews today with none other than Lance Stephenson. We'll break down why the Pacers might want him back, why they might not want him back, what I ultimately think will happen, and more on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers as always. My name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and the Westside Community News. And today, we're going back to the player free agency profiles. Last week, we did O'Shea Brissett to get this series started. Today, we will move to none other than fan favorite Lance Stephenson. Talked about this a little bit on last Friday's show. We'll get into it in full detail today. Why the Pacers would want to bring Lance Stephenson back, why they might not want to bring Lance Stephenson back, what I ultimately think will happen with some comps and contract values that I think make sense for Lance Stephenson if the Pacers do want to bring him back. If you want to hear Lance speak on his own free agency, go back to the podcast from 2 Wednesdays ago where I put all the audio in from players who spoke about their upcoming free agency at Exit Interviews. Today was supposed to be a prospect preview podcast. That will now be tomorrow, breaking down one of the Duke guys. I won't say which one. But it'll be very fun. So looking forward to that. But today is all about Lance and his free agency. So Lance signs a 1-year minimum deal right before the trade deadline to be with the Pacers for the rest of the season. His contract has now expired. Technically, it doesn't expire till June 31st, but he can't be traded. So no harm, no foul there. His contract is by all means expired at this point. So why would the Pacers bring him back? Well, Lance just had, as we talked about last week on his season recap, the best season or the best passing season he's ever had, right? He filled in as the backup point guard for the Pacers very ably when just after Brad Wanamaker was cut, when Kiefer Sykes was struggling, when Brogdon was down with injuries, when LeVert was down with injuries and even traded, when TJ McConnell was down with injuries. They needed him to play the backup one spot behind Halliburton, behind Brogdon, whoever was available for them. They needed Lance to be a backup one. And it's been proven time and time again that when Lance has the ball in his hands, he's more effective than without it. Ratcheted up his assist numbers this season per minute, the best numbers he's ever put up, 7.5 assists per 36 minutes. He was very quality for the Pacers as a backup one on the offensive side of the ball. Specifically, it was the best passing he's ever had. Obviously, had that huge assist game against Utah in his second home game with the Pacers, dishing out 14 assists, which ended up as his career high. That was a crazy game. And that kind of just highlighted everything that was good about Lance for the Pacers this season, especially offensively, is that, especially early when he was with the team, when Sabonis was still on the Pacers, those two clicked really well together and allowed Lance to really get into the lane, really dive in and set the offense in motion. And the way Carlisle's teams play, a lot of downhill attacking and some speed in transition, that worked really well for how the Pacers were doing. And him, Lance, with Sabonis in particular, was a very good duo. They would be separated often early in his tenure. That didn't make a lot of sense to me. So the biggest argument for the Pacers bringing back Lance Stephenson next year is just that he was a solid backup one for them. I mean, not too much above replacement level, I would say, but because his passing was so good, he could play that point guard role quite effectively, and that really made him, useful for them, even though their season was really poor in general. Another thing in his favor, at least in terms of being a free agent, why the Pacers might want to pursue a talented player, is he'll be cheap, right? He was out of the league for 2 years prior to this year. He played for the Lakers in 2018-19 and then was out of the league the next year playing in China. The Pacers tried to sign him right at the worst timing for Lance, that the pandemic really impacted the NBA. They couldn't bring guys who were overseas into the bubble, so Lance could not sign for the rest of the season at that time. Then the following season, they didn't really have room on the team for him, not a lot of roster spots that summer, so they had to wait until 2021-22 to actually get him in the door. And even then, it took hardship deals for him to kind of come back through the G League. So even though he was solid this year, he outplayed Kiefer Sykes, he outplayed Brad Wanamaker. These aren't high bars to clear, but they are important in the context of him being a reserve point guard or a depth piece for a future team in the NBA. Like Wanamaker and Sykes proved that they could at least be replacement level guards that a team who needed emergency point guard depth could rely on. For Lance, he exceeded those guys in terms of impact, right? So if you're at any team in the NBA, Pacers included, who needs that depth point guard and is scraping the bottom of the barrel for a minimum guy, right? Lance seems like a better option than those guys. And because, maybe he can get more than this, but because typically, if you're out of the league for 2 years and have to fight through the G League, you're not going to get more than a minimum deal unless you kind of prove it for a while. And he did play well for the Pacers. He played 40 games. That's kind of a lot. but it's not so much sample size that any team's going to be like really ready to dig into him. So from a Pacers perspective, the appeal of Lance is he could be a very solid passing, cheap backup point guard. And that's obviously valuable, but especially last season, as we saw, Brad Wanamaker was their first attempt at this, right? And they didn't even want Wanamaker to be the backup one. I think that kind of gets lost sometimes with him. He was supposed to be the third string point guard behind Brogdon and McConnell. And then also, if you remember really early in the season, once LeVert came back, LeVert was the backup point guard, and they kind of swapped that out as much as possible to not make Wanamaker run the show too much, right? And then they needed it because McConnell got hurt and he just couldn't cut it. But in general, to say, cheap backup ones who, even if they're the third or fourth guy, they can have a big impact on your season. Like Wanamaker cost the Pacers quite a few games in a crucial part of their schedule in early December when their season was still kind of, maybe they can salvage this thing. They got to 2 games under 500 at one point, right around McConnell's injury. They went 500 in November, which is, again, not a good team, but at least the bar that they at least sort of expected, and 500 would have got them very close to the plan if they could have maintained that through an easier part of their schedule. So had they had Lance potentially all season, like they might have had a much better year where they make different decisions and make different choices. So the sale on Lance, why the Pacers would want to bring him back, is pretty easy. The cheap backup point guards are important for the structure of your team throughout the whole season. And then the last factor is the obvious one, right? And this was especially so the case this past season. He's a fan favorite. He puts butts in seats. He takes jerseys off the rack, brings in revenue, and that's always a good thing. And I've talked about this on the show a million times, but it always just blew my, at first when Lance Stephenson returns to Gainbridge Fieldhouse, yes, I understand tons of cheers are coming. Fan favorite, was a key player on those teams that were awesome and made the conference finals runs, was still solid for them on the teams that pushed LeBron to 7 with Victor Oladipo leading the charge, right? Every time he's come to the Pacers prior to this stint, I would say, things have gone well and they've had exciting series and he's made some exciting moments. Even that 2016-17 year when he came in for the last 6 games and helped them push into the postseason, even though they got swept that year, they barely got swept that year and he was a big part of that, right? Every time he's with the Pacers, their ethos kind of changes a little bit. Guys like being around him. He's got an infectious personality and things go well in the playoffs. And so he's earned this fan favorite personality by the way he plays, by his on-court antics and maneuvers, right? All this stuff. Like, it makes sense why he's so popular. But for me, I kind of thought, as is most novelty things, like after about 5 games, maybe 10 games, so most fans could see him play at home, that the cheers would go away. No. The rest of the season, literally through their last home game, when he would check in, loudest roar of the game, right? Like, by outside of maybe Halliburton's introductions for a while, he was getting the loudest roar from the crowd every game he played. So he earned that, right? He was solid and deserved that because of his history with the team and because he was playing well this year, right? That huge 20-point quarter he had against the Nets, the 14 assist game right after, he proved it right away. He can help this team be better. So the selling point for Lance to be back with the Pacers next year and all the pros are really obvious, right? He played well he was their best replacement level backup point guard they signed this past year. He proved that he can play well in the system Rick Carlisle has, especially at the 1, because he can pass well, get into the lane, and kind of get guys in motion and make it move around. He's not going to be expensive next year because he was out of the league for 3 years and, quite frankly, had to fight for a minimum contract this year, right? They were doing the 10-day dance with him for forever, and he's a fan favorite, right? A lot of stuff suggests that Lance Stephenson on a minimum is a good signing, and he's a fine depth piece, right? Like, even if next year they want him to be that Wanamaker level guy, you're like the 4th or the 5th or 6th guard, however far back you want to say, makes a lot of sense, especially on a minimum contract. So there are a lot of pros to bringing Lance back that I think the Pacers will consider, but there are also a lot of cons, perhaps more cons than pros, which is really interesting for a guy who just, again, had a good season, would be cheap, and would play a crucial position at depth guard that, like I just said, if your depth guards are poor, things like with Brad Wanamaker experiment in late November and all of December can change your season drastically. It's important that they nail that kind of stuff, and they did not nail it for 3 months last season until Lance really joined the team. And at that point, it was too late. The season was already sunk. So what are the cons of bringing back Lance for the Pacers next year? What on the flip side do they have to consider? And reasons the Pacers might say, you know what? We're going to look elsewhere with this roster spot, or we don't need more guards or whatever. There are a couple that I want to go through that I think are pretty important in the context of this discussion. Let's talk about those. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you guys about the people over at betonline.net, your number one source for all of your sports betting stats and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. Warriors Grizzlies just wrapped up about 2 minutes before I recorded this. Hell of a game. The playoffs are awesome, and BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information for those games, from live betting to playoffs to esports and more. They've got all the lines for Monday's games up. Heat favored by 7.5 over the Embiidless Sixers. Suns favored by 5.5 over the Mavs. I'm very excited for those series to get going, and you can see all that over at betonline.net. Head over to that website today, or use your mobile device to sign up and learn more about the trends in the action over at betonline.net. BetOnline is where the game starts. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On Now. Hear the latest and greatest from our local experts covering the teams that played in playoffs yesterday and all the big news around the NBA, including potentially the Kings narrowing their coaching search down. Will be on there. All the game action from playoffs this weekend will be there. It's an awesome show, and you get the local angle on all those teams and games. So Lance Stephenson's free agency just ran through the pros. They're quite extensive, right? Cheap, good depth guards are valuable to have, especially for a team looking to turn around a sunken season like the Pacers. There are also some cons to bringing back Lance Stephenson. And look, the main one with a lot of these guards is something I talked about last week, or I have talked about on many of the season reviews for these guards. I talked about this with Kiefer Sykes and with Lance Stephenson last week on their season reviews. The Pacers don't have a ton of open roster spots heading into this offseason, right? Guaranteed to be free agents from the very end of the season, guys. You got Lance Stephenson, Jalen Smith, TJ Warren, and Ricky Rubio. That's 4 guys, right? And then there's a chance any of those guys could be back. And the Pacers have the 31st pick and that first rounder that's pretty high. So if those 2 picks, and they have the 58th pick, I mean, that could be a roster spot guy, could be a 2-way guy, who knows? But there's a chance the Pacers enter this offseason with just 2 open roster spots, right? It's hard to predict trades, but just thinking about it like that, roster spots are hard to come by. So they need to be pretty picky about what they do, and it depends on their goals, right? Do they want to be kind of a crawl, walk, run team where they crawled last year, they'll walk this coming season, so they don't necessarily spend on good players now. They kind of, not punt year, but gap year it a little bit. Or they want to go for it, go back to being the Pacers that the Pacers have been for years and years and years, and not be this bad again, right? So their goals will be important in how they use those roster spots, but only having 2 means they have to be pretty picky with how they use them. And when you enter an offseason where you have to be picky with your roster spots, already having under contract Malcolm Brogdon, Chris Duarte, Tyrese Halliburton, Buddy Hield, TJ McConnell, that's just 5. That's already 5 guards under contract. Dwayne Washington's under contract. That's a 6th one, right? There are already a hefty number of guards that the Pacers will have under contract when next season starts. So if you are Lance, if you're the Pacers and you need to sign someone to one of your 2 very coveted roster spots that you need to improve your team, you're probably thinking forward. You might have Miles Turner, Isaiah Jackson, Goga Bitadze. Who knows how the draft goes? But they already have center and guard, not all the way filled up, but pretty much all the way filled up, to the point that they should not be theoretically allocating their offseason resources there. So that is the strongest argument against bringing back Lance Stephenson to me, is if you sign him, he's the 7th guard on the team, right? Like, Dwayne Washington might start the season out of the rotation next year, depending on how they can find minutes for Chris Duarte playing more often and where Buddy Hield shakes out and all these things, right? If Dwayne Washington's not playing, Lance Stephenson is definitely not playing. And again, it's very important to have a solid group of depth guards, as the Pacers found out the hard way last year. But like, McConnell's going to be right at the back end of that guard rotation if Halliburton and Brogdon are starting. McConnell and Hield off the bench. Duarte's probably in that mix too, right? That's all. Dwayne Washington, I haven't even said his name yet. Like, they have guys who step in and fill other roles in the case of injuries that they would go to before Lance even touches the floor. So the biggest con against Lance isn't even anything to do with his game, his ability, what he brings to Rick Carlisle's Pacers. It's that they just have such a tight roster crunch that bringing him in, is the opportunity cost is really high, right? You have now used a roster spot on something that you can't get someone else in the door with it at a more important position, right? Depth at a more important spot, because their forward rotation next year entering the offseason is pretty bad. to put it lightly, it's pretty bad. I mean, Isaiah Jackson can maybe play the forward spots. Terry Taylor, you can definitely say, can play the forward spots. Chris Duarte and O'Shea Brissett, probably, maybe you count Duarte as a guard, but that's kind of it. You know, they are really light on forwards. So the opportunity cost of bringing Lance back is the strongest thing to me, and that's true for any guard free agent the Pacers have. Like, Dwayne Washington could be a free agent. I highly doubt it, right? Ricky Rubio, Kiefer Sykes, like, bringing them back, I get why you'd think about it as the Pacers, but it's really hard for me to see a way that they would even get on the floor for the Pacers. Nonetheless, be more important to bring back or get on the team than someone who plays a more important position. So because those roster spots are so important, that's a big one. And I already mentioned the guards thing, but just even roster spots in general makes it so even if he was a forward, a bit player, it would be kind of harder to want to bring back. But one that's already in a stacked position with so many guards just makes it not necessarily something that, to me, the Pacers should want to pursue. The other factor against bringing Lance back is, quite frankly, a timeline thing. He is 31 right now. Before next season starts, he'll be 32 years old. And again, being a fan favorite, the age thing doesn't really matter. It's not like a hindrance. And I actually am of the opinion that having veterans on a young and growing team is very important to help those guys learn the NBA, to help those guys see what guys who have been on winning teams does. Like Lance's value of going to 2 conference finals and playing with LeBron James for a season, like that is valuable to a young team. I do not want to belittle that. But he's also just well outside of their range of ages that makes sense to me. In fact, I would argue that Brogdon and Hield are out of the age of ranges that make sense to me. Like Miles Turner was born in 1996. He is 6 years older than Lance, and he's like the very top of, to me, the kind of age range that makes sense for guys on the Pacers to kind of grow with the core that they currently have. They have a ton of guys between 1996 and 2000 where Halliburton is and Miles Turner are, and that's kind of the core of their team to me, with a couple of guys who are a little younger. The guys older than that, their spot on the team should be kind of just thought of as in flux in general because of the timeline of the Pacers, right? As those guys grow and get better, the spots will naturally be filtered out for the veterans who don't fit with the team or are falling off a little bit, whatever seems to happen. And Lance does not appear to be falling off. And again, I see value in having vets on this Pacers team as it is growing and is constructed. But as he is so far outside of what makes sense for their timeline, it doesn't necessarily make sense for my seat for them to bring back a guy who is 32 years old when the next season starts. Now, he was still very solid at 31, so maybe that means nothing in terms of him falling off production-wise, but as this team grows, they would like to allocate those minutes to younger players, right? There was always, when McMillan was the coach, if you'll recall, there was a lot of debate amongst people who covered the team, amongst fans, even amongst the Pacers a little bit of, who should they be playing? TJ McConnell, who's 27 or 28 at the time, or Aaron Holiday, right? And Holiday never ended up really panning out, but he also didn't play a lot because TJ McConnell got a lot of favor at that spot. So it was hard to see Aaron Holiday develop in that case. And I don't know that the Pacers would play Lance over any young guys, but removing the choice entirely kind of forces them to play young guys. And it's not like, you'll kick yourself in the foot for not having Lance Stephenson and playing your young guy instead of him instead. So I think the fan favorite stuff outweighs this point of bringing him back. Like you can't just say, oh, he's old, there's no point, because again, he puts butts in seats and is very popular amongst the Indianapolis community. Like if you've seen the video of him at the Kroger on the north side, like so many fans came out to see him there, right? Like I don't think any other player could have drawn that big of a crowd except for maybe Halliburton at this stage. So I don't think the age timeline thing's a big deal, but I definitely think it's a negative, but it doesn't outweigh the fan favorite stuff. So I think a lot of the arguments for Lance is, what do the Pacers value more? Just having that seventh cheapo guard who can fill in if there's a lot of injuries. And, I keep saying that they have other guys who would fill in, sure, but they also have Malcolm Brogdon on the team, who is inevitably going to miss time next season, right? And no doubter that he will miss some time. TJ McConnell, who's coming off of an injury, who knows? Buddy Hield does not miss very much time, but Duarte missed a bunch of time his rookie year. Where does that fit in? Halliburton, we don't have a ton of sample, but he missed a lot of time his rookie year as well. He played all his games for the Pacers. So, there's a chance that there's enough injuries that Lance would be, needed, right? And having a quality seventh guard is important. So the Pacers have to decide what's more important to them. Having that cheapo quality seventh guard who could give them serviceable minutes and fits pretty well with the system they were trying to do last year, or do the cons outweigh that for them where they say, this is a terrible use of a roster spot for us. We already have a bunch of guards. We really need more forwards. We cannot be using this on a guy who's not going to play. What did they find more important? I think that's going to be crucial for them. And looking at the numbers, maybe they value this as well. Maybe they value those as even things, where they look back at last season, and when Lance was in the game, the Pacers' defensive rating was 122.4, and their offensive rating was 114.1. And when he was out of the game, their offensive rating dropped a little bit to 112.8, but their defensive rating went way lower, 115.4. So they were way better defensively with him off. And I think this is a big factor in this. Lance was not a good defender this past season. He was okay on the ball. He's strong and stocky for a guard, but his off-ball defense was awful, awful, awful this past season. Probably the worst it's been his whole career. So maybe he works on it this past season, and if you go back to listen to him talking about what he's focused on in this free agency period, keeping his body right and staying in shape because he wanted to keep playing. Like, I think if he can work on being a little more engaged off the ball and can sell that to the Pacers, then I think the pros would outweigh the cons. But as it stands, it's a pretty close call, and I get why the Pacers would consider kind of both sides of this equation as near equal. So, what do I think is going to happen in this? I did this with O'Shea Brissett last week, found some comparable contracts from the prior offseason. Do the same exercise again today. Before we do that, though, let's talk about Built Bar, the best tasting protein bars on the market. Summer's coming. In the summer, you're going to need some food on the go. Built Bars are the perfect snack to take with you on your family vacations, out to work, on a work trip. You can throw it in your bag, in your kids' backpacks. Make sure that everyone has a bar so you are fueled for your summer adventures. The best part about Built Bars, they're healthy and delicious. No more sacrificing delicious food for health. With Built Bar, you can have both. It's easy. All you got to do is go to Built.com and order them now. They are 100% covered in chocolate, delicious protein bars that are healthy and great for the health conscious guys. So you can eat healthy and actually enjoy it. If it's not enough flavor for you, you can try the mix box that has a bunch of different flavors. My favorite is the peanut butter brownie, but that mix pack has 12 of their most popular flavors and some of their puff ones that have like a marshmallow infusion. So there's something for everybody. Most of them have 130 calories, 4 grams of net carbs, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. You got to try them yourself. Go to Built.com to try it or get your favorites. If you use the promo code LOCKED15 when you check out, you'll get 15% off your order of Built Bars. Use that promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, Locked On NBA is the place to go to get the scoopage about the NBA playoffs. Jackson Gatlin will be hosting with a bunch of our Locked On NBA hosts around the network. Let's talk about what I think will happen to Lance Stephenson's free agency. And I'm not going to lie to you guys. This one is tough for me because I think the pros and cons are really close to equal in this instance, right? Last week's guy we highlighted was O'Shea Brissett. Super easy. The pros, enormous. The cons, very small. I think he should be back with the Pacers. With Lance, the roster spot thing is really big to me. Like, they need forwards really badly. And it could. So the trouble I have with making an easy determination on what do I think is going to happen with Lance Stephenson is I don't know who the Pacers are going to draft. Right? If they pick Jaden Ivey, if they pick any top-level guard, although really Ivey is the guard in this draft class, most of the top guys are forwards. But if they pick a guard, I guess you can count Johnny Davis as a guard. I don't know. Whatever. If they pick Jaden Ivey, for example, now they have another guard. Then they definitely would not want Lance back. But if they get to draft night and they end up trading Malcolm Brogdon or trading TJ McConnell or trading Buddy Hield, any of these things that make sense, like I just said, those guys are older and outside the Pacers timeline a little bit, they could free up minutes for Halliburton. They could get Chris Duarte in a more natural ball role, like where he could have the ball more often. Those moves would make sense to me too. And if those happen, if they trade a guard and then don't draft one, all of a sudden it makes way more sense to bring back Lance. So my stupid, corny, not a take answer is what I think will happen with Lance is I don't know. It depends on what happens with other stuff this offseason. Because to me, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, look, Chris Duarte and Tyrese Halliburton, basically locks to be back with the Pacers. Like, as close as you can get to it. I don't think any player in the NBA is ever untouchable, untradeable, whatever. Like, we've seen that crazy things happen all the time. But those two are as close to locks to be back with the Pacers next year as you can get. But Brogdon at 29 years old and Buddy Hield at 29 years old. Ricky Rubio is obviously a free agent. TJ McConnell's up there in age at, I think he is 29 as well, actually. That's a frequent age for the Pacers right now, right? They have these older guards who are not on the same timeline and all need the ball to be successful, or at least mostly need the ball to be successful. Plus Dwayne Washington, I'm almost positive Dwayne will be back. We'll do a segment on his free agency at some point this offseason. There are some parts that are moving in a way that if they get rid of multiple of those guys, then it makes sense for Lance to be back, right? And so I don't know. If all those guys are back with the Pacers next year, or even they add another guard via the draft, or in some trade that they do, maybe they ship out Miles Turner in a deal, that's been talked about for forever and ever, or they do a sign and trade with Warren or Rubio or something, and they bring back another guard, which again, I don't know that that's a priority, but if they get good value, they get good value. Then I don't think Lance would be back. And so a lot of his free agency and his chance of returning to the Pacers, to me, depends on what other moves the Pacers make. Now, here's the thing. I would say between Brogdon and Buddy Hield and TJ McConnell, I don't know that there's a big chance that all three are back with the Pacers next year. It's possible, right? They have very rarely, have Buddy Hield and TJ McConnell played together. Brogdon, all three of the guys playing in the same game has never happened. So seeing how the Pacers are with lots of veteran guards, around Halliburton and Chris Duarte and Isaiah Jackson and Turner has never been seen. Turner's never been seen with Buddy Hield ever, right? Turner and TJ McConnell barely played together this year, right? There are a lot of ways the Pacers could say we want all those guys back, but because they're all older and require the ball, and as the Tyrese Halliburton era in Indy started and kind of evolved, it became more clear that Halliburton needs the ball more than he got it when he was playing with some other guards. Especially with McConnell, it was clear McConnell had it too much. And with Brogdon at first, it seemed like a good fit, but as even it was only 8 games, kind of by the end of that, it became more clear to me, and I think everybody, that Halliburton is a little bit better of a distributor and needs the ball more. So maybe if the Pacers find a way this offseason to keep those guys but give them an off-ball role, yeah, what I'm saying is dumb. But it seems to me that bringing back all three of Hield, Brogdon, and McConnell seems not like the best thing the Pacers could do with their roster situation. And maybe they can make it work, or maybe they think it could work with all those guys, but it seems like it would hurt Halliburton's development a little too much. And so I would imagine one of those guys at least will be moved. And in that case, then bringing Lance back seems like a logical, smart move to me. But if they draft a guard or acquire another one, it doesn't make as much sense. So that's a lot of moving parts to consider with Lance Stephenson's free agency. And why my answer is I don't know, because what I think makes sense isn't always what the team thinks makes sense. I don't know everything. I know some things. I don't know everything. And I don't know what the Pacers have out there that we don't even know about, right? So impossible to really say. But what the Pacers can do is important to talk about here, because they might stay over the cap and not have cap space. They might have cap space. So they could, if they have cap space, they can sign Lance to whatever deal fits under the salary cap. If they stay over, they can either bring him back on a minimum, or they can give him a deal using non-bird rights, which would give him a 20% raise over his minimum salary, which would be about a $2.2 million deal. That's nothing. I mean, the minimum $2.2 million, it's nothing. It's super irrelevant, not irrelevant, but it's very minor in the grand scheme of the team building process. So if they want to bring him back, if they're over the cap or under the cap, it's very easy to do so. You can sign a minimum guy anytime. You can use non-bird rights anytime, so long as you're not hard capped. So bringing Lance back contractually, like legally within the rules, super easy if they have the means to do so and the roster spots to do so. And so like last offseason, like Langston Galloway signed a minimum contract with Phoenix. Rodney Hood signed a minimum contract with, I believe, Milwaukee, although he got traded midseason, so I can't exactly remember where he started the season. Raul Neto re-signed on a minimum deal with the Washington Wizards, right? Like those guys all have about the value that Lance had this year to me, at least last year going into free agency. Shaq Harrison, who I actually really like as a defensive guy, he came back he got a minimum contract with, I believe, Philly last year. DeAndre Bembry got a minimum deal last summer. Like these are guys that are guard or guard adjacent, Elfrid Payton, that are about the impact level that Lance had for the Pacers this year, that all got minimum deals. None of them got that 20% bump that is technically possible for non-bird rights guys. Like it's really rare that if you're that close to the line, you actually get that pay bump. So to me, I think like Max Struss got the bump. Gabe Vincent might have got it. It's pretty rare. So I think that Lance signing a minimum deal would be what would happen if he comes back to the Pacers. If Lance is back on the Pacers next year as their last guard on the team, maybe even just a partially guaranteed minimum deal, which that makes a lot of sense to me, because then the Pacers, who have this roster spot crunch, let's say they get halfway through the season, he's not playing at all, then boom, they have a way of getting off of him and saving some money. And if he's playing a lot, great, they can guarantee the minimum contract. That makes a lot of sense to me. So if there's like minor moves and they need a depth guard, Lance Stephenson on like a half guaranteed contract or something, that makes a lot of sense to me. If they don't move any guards, bringing Lance back doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And if they draft a guard, bringing Lance back doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But if they make some moves and they have a need for, a sixth guard or someone who could handle it a little bit in the case of an emergency, yes, bringing back Lance Stephenson does make some sense to me, and probably does to the Pacers as well, because they know his value as a fan favorite, and they brought him back. Kevin Pritchard has signed him once and then tried to sign him again and then did sign him again, right? This front office clearly sees the value he has to the franchise, or at least can have to the franchise. So they know that they have that option available to them. The question is, how do they view it in the context of their current roster construction with the spots that they have and with the guards that they have? That I don't know, and that remains to be determined. But I think Lance's free agency will come down to other stuff the Pacers do, more so than anything Lance did for the Pacers last year. I hope that all makes sense. And if you love Lance, as most fans do, feel free to yell at me on the internet. I'm on Twitter at TEastNBA, and this show is at Locked On Pacers. Call me an idiot, whatever. I'm happy to talk about this, or the cap minutia that goes into re-signing a player like Lance Stephenson next season. Of course, this is supposed to be a midweek thing as we do the player recaps. Tomorrow, since you got to the end, you get to know we're doing a prospect review of Duke forward AJ Griffin, one of my favorites this year. It's going to be super, super fun. And then this week we'll, of course, do 2 more player season recap groups. Veteran bigs will be in there, so Turner, Sabonis, and Goga. And then I'll do a second one that's kind of hard to explain the group, but don't worry, that one will be coming either Thursday or Friday, depending on how the rest of the week goes. So I hope everybody had a great weekend and is enjoying the NBA playoffs. Again, tomorrow we're back with the prospect recaps. Hope to see you then, and have a great rest of your day.